Hello, and thank you for listening. My name is Shaunak Sastry. I am an associate professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Cincinnati. I'm also the director of the Cincinnati Project, and my talk today is titled Community Partnered Research at the Cincinnati Project. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers of the Center for Public Engagement with Science for the opportunity to share some information about the TCP and what we do and who we are. So the overview of my talk for today really sort of begins with talking about our work and our vision at the Cincinnati Project. We'll talk a little bit about the mainstreaming or the politics of community partnered research in higher education today. I will discuss a little bit about what we mean by the term community and the challenges in defining and locating this term. And then I will end by offering a brief snapshot of some of our work, ongoing and past work, to give you a sense of the kind of research we do and support. So to begin with, in terms of who we are and our identity, on our website and on our mission statement, we say that the Cincinnati Project harnesses the expertise from the University of Cincinnati's College of Arts and Sciences and community partners to conduct research that promotes equity and directly benefits marginalized communities in Cincinnati. This guiding framework really undergirds a lot of the politics of our work, and you will see how as I explain further. As is expected, the TCP is led by a community of scholars in the College of Arts and Sciences. Our leadership team, which comprises of the individuals that are on the slide, represent a range of disciplines and perspectives within the College of Arts and Sciences. One of the defining features of the Cincinnati Project as a hub for doing community research in Cincinnati is that we are in many ways a sort of a horizontal organization. We sort of make decisions through consensus and are pretty sort of egalitarian in our outlook in terms of who we are as an organization, and we get along. For now, I am the incoming director of this space, although I have been associated with it since its inception in 2015. Along with me, the members on the leadership team include Leila Rodriguez, who's the assistant director, Tia Sherry Gaynor, who was my predecessor as director of the TCP, Letitia Bates, who's the associate dean for community engagement and inclusive excellence and the College of Arts and Sciences, Kimberly Conger, who is in the Department of Political Science in the College of Arts and Sciences, and Roderick Pearson, who is our research associate and is also a doctoral student in sociology. And so this is kind of the core leadership team of the Cincinnati Project. We also have a large advisory board which includes members of our UC faculty, members of nonprofit and civil society organizations, as well as members of relevant corporate and other institutions that are local. Okay, so let me start by sort of talking a little bit about our work and our vision. The Cincinnati Project harnesses expertise from the community and expertise from within the College of Arts and Sciences to do research that directly benefits marginalized communities in Cincinnati. Our approach to this is to what we call center the needs and the benefits to the community. What does this mean? And to understand the context of this, we need a slight detour into thinking about the relationship between academic research teams and community organizations and communities today, especially when it comes to large urban research universities like ours at the University of Cincinnati, and the communities in which these institutions find themselves, and the ways that these institutions serve or fail to serve the communities that they are located within. In some way, trends in social and behavioral research point to the mainstreaming of community-based approaches or community-based participatory approaches to research. If we were to use some proxy for the popularity of community-based approaches, you would say that there is a definite increase towards the recognition or the call for the greater involvement of quote-unquote communities in social and behavioral research. This is evidenced by calls in federal funded research programs like the NIH funding mechanisms or NSF funding mechanisms towards requiring evidence for community engagement in their funding mechanisms. What is interesting at this stage, even as community-based research becomes this new sort of buzzword in social science research, is how the calls for community engagement are discursively sort of construed, right? So I say there are broadly two appeals that are made and two rationales for why communities ought to be at the center or at least at the table when deciding what research is to be done to them, at them, with them, right? So there is very often two sort of interrelated appeals. One is the appeal of justice or ethics, right? The idea that doing community-based research involving community voices is the right thing to do, moves us towards justice, towards equity, towards better representation in research. And this sort of has a sort of more historical perspective in terms of the histories of mistreatment of community, of exploitation of communities in the research process. So that is one. And the other orientation is the better science argument, the idea that community-based approaches are not just innovative and novel for their own sake, but they also produce better science, they produce better outcomes. So broadly, I bifurcate these two in somewhat artificially in sort of saying that there's a right thing to do argument versus a better science argument. Our kind of vision at the Cincinnati Project is that it doesn't necessarily need to be one or the other, or our work is in sort of making the argument that better science is undeniably linked to what is best ethically for communities that are served, and vice versa, right? That the ethics of research ought to be front and center when thinking about what are the outcomes that affect communities on whom research is done. As community-based research gets more mainstream, there emerges a new sort of language and nuancing in differentiating between community-based research, community-partnered research, participatory research, right? So there are these sort of there's an emergent lexicon of what these terms mean. And even as that exists, there is also, and this is kind of part of the challenge of why TCP is so clear about the principle of direct benefit, is that a lot of with the emergence or with the recognition that community-based research needs to be at the forefront, there is also a lot of what I would call pseudo community-based research, a lot of appeals to community that looks like kind of, takes the appearance of community-based research, but fails to account for some fundamental principles of community-based participatory research, right? Like Cook and Kothari said about 20 years ago, participation in research continues to be a way of talking about rather than doing things. And this is sort of all too common even in how CBPR or participatory research paradigms are designed. The researcher designs a problem, the role of the community is deciphered a priori without the presence of the community, and then community organizations are called to the table or invited to sort of fill a hole that academic researchers have identified as important, right? So the role of community really there is missing. In that context, in the context of the acceleration and the sort of proliferation of community-based research, much of it sort of questionable in its orientation, our work is guided by a set of sort of principles and politics that I would like to share. One and the primary sort of way in which we think about this is defining the problem. Who defines the problem, right? The problem, at least in the context of the Cincinnati Project, all research that is organized under the aegis of TCP is defined at the local community level by organizations that work directly with the communities or the community members themselves. This is sort of a crucial thematic of my own personal research. I'm a health communication scholar, and I think about and study the role of culture as a shaping mechanism in the proliferation of health campaigns targeting cultural minorities. And one of the defining characteristics of community-based research that is ethical, or this an argument that I have made recently, is that problems are defined locally. That the problem definition is sort of the first step towards research that is sort of ethical in orientation. And the second principle that the Cincinnati Project sort of abides by is the idea of outcomes and direct measurable benefits. As you can see, this is a sort of a tough one to negotiate often at times, because research benefits are often not direct, often not tangible. They are often implied. They are often linked to sort of better knowledge, and so better prevention and better attitudes, sort of a second or third order benefit for communities. Our attempt is to quantify, bring out what the direct benefits are for the communities in question. Sort of going off the first 2 points, the sort of pragmatic way in which we do this is all research projects that are either funded by or organized by or sort of made real by the Cincinnati Project begin with community partners as the starting point, and they are at the ground zero of all our work. They begin the articulation of a problem that we then back engineer as the leadership team of the Cincinnati Project. We take a community articulated problem and then back engineer it into how does this relate to a research problem? How can a community need, an unmet need, evidenced through communities' local expertise of their situation, of the problems that affect them, how can we then back translate those into researchable problems that faculty or students at UC can address? Which sort of brings us to the sort of the big picture theoretical but also practical debate about the community. Who is the community? How does one define that? What are the challenges in sort of creating this boundary around what the community means? Who do we represent and who do we leave out? Recognizing that this is in some ways a perennially unfinished or a non-final kind of question, we think about the politics of representation in communities as we go about our work. One of the key sort of signature events that we put out as a Cincinnati Project is a symposium that we do every year, where we showcase the work that we have done, the work that we have undergone in that year, as well as have a keynote speaker talk about the politics of doing community research. As in the sort of beginning, in our early journey as a collective of researchers, we sort of pondered about this question quite a lot, about how do we define community? How do we how does one conceptualize this? How does one think about it in terms of either a geographical, physical dimension of community, in the sense that there is a sort of an urban core around the University of Cincinnati that we can sort of point to geographically as a community, as the subject of our work. Community is also sort of you can thought about in a sort of a cultural linguistic dimension, and this is sort of often thought about in that context, and recognizing that the term community itself is often sort of politicized, racialized within a sort of academic discourse and mainstream discourse in the United States, that the term community is often used to refer to ethnic minorities, racial minorities, in a way that is not necessarily pejorative, but it does have some sort of othering capacity in some way. So to come back to return to the excerpt about our keynote, one of our keynote speakers in our symposium, the Black feminist theorist Patricia Hill Collins, when we took this problem to her about community, she offered us a mantra for thinking through this in her sort of quintessential, sort of sharp, unique way. She said, it really comes down to three questions: who makes the decisions, who benefits from the research, and who pays for it? And we've sort of taken this three-pronged approach: who decides, who benefits, who pays, as a sort of a guiding framework to think about what do we mean by community? Who do we refer to? Who are we leaving out? Who speaks for communities, right? Recognizing that there are always orders of representation, that as community-based research becomes mainstream, becomes commonplace, and becomes a requirement, that there also emerges a sort of community engagement sort of complex, right? There is a set of institutions and organizations that respond to this need to create the appearance of community engagement. The Cincinnati Project has been very specific and been very deliberate about developing individual relationships with community members, knowing the specific histories of the relationship between the University of Cincinnati and its community, which has often been overwhelmingly negative, overwhelmingly defined by a lack of trust, and which has sort of historically stripped away local communities' ability to speak as equals or speak with expertise, right? Communities as folks who have things done to them rather than who decide how best research can serve their agenda, serve their interests. To recognize also then the extractive logics that are at heart of modern academic institutions like the University of Cincinnati, where there is, sort of we exist in this sort of paradoxical relationship with the community, where on the one hand we recognize them as sources of sort of innovation and capital in that sense. Our research comes from there, but there is also sort of an extractive mode of thinking about how to use communities, and that historical legacies are very clearly existent certainly at my university, but also at universities across the country. And so that definitional work, who decides, who benefits, who pays, is really at the heart of the research that we organize and that we support, in thinking about undoing some of these historical legacies that exist. The historical legacies between universities and communities that doing community-based work now allows us to even acknowledge, to perhaps begin attempt to undoing. So moving on to our sort of scope of work, the Cincinnati Project is a collection of scholars who do basically sort of who matchmake, right? Who matchmake between a community articulated problem and the capacity that we have as academic researchers. And most of our work falls into four broad areas, and this is not neat, but it's sort of accurate for the sake of this retelling. We engage the community through sort of four core areas, and these are faculty-led research programs, which are, like I said, these are problems that we bring to faculty researchers once we have done that sort of collaborative co-construction of the problem with communities to sort of translate their unmet needs into research problems with sort of RQs, with questions, with deadlines, with hypotheses, what have you, right? So a lot of the translation, the back translational work is what the leadership team of the Cincinnati Project does. The other format that we often depend on is classroom-based research, and I will show you a couple of examples in the slides that will follow of how we often allow our students to engage with research tools in order to solve a community articulated need. That this is an opportunity for students at UC in the College of Arts and Sciences through their capstone courses, or undergraduate courses, or graduate courses to really get at understanding the relationship between research and societal problem, right? Like building that connection between the sort of abstractness of research methods and the concreteness of a problem, like eviction, like disparities to cancer prevention, so on and so forth. We also do sort of events and training. This is an area that we are thinking about, seriously thinking about growing in terms of offering more systematic ways in mentoring and training researchers who are interested in doing community-based work, the ethics of it, the politics of it, the pragmatics of it, having sort of becoming advocates for community-based work in terms of tenure and promotion guidelines, in terms of being an advocate for communities as they engage for more equitable places at the table at universities. And finally, we also occasionally do special projects when they don't necessarily neatly fit in one of these other silos. So our job as a leadership team is really to figure out, where does a problem fit best? How do we back translate a community-based, a community articulated problem into one of these sort of core areas? Our footprint in Cincinnati today is pretty extensive. We work with a wide range of community organizations, activist groups, advocacy groups, with our advisory board that represents a wide range of actors in the local area. And for a full list is available on our website, which I have linked on the slide. So just to sort of end the presentation, I want to give you a quick snapshot of some of the work, the existing and sort of previous work that we have done, recognizing that it's sort of difficult to do that in the time that we have. Just want to give you sort of a quick snapshot. One of some of our most visible work has been the work with on eviction prevention. This was led by a doctoral student in sociology, Elena Jones-Wolfe, whose work on mapping eviction rates in Hamilton County was path-breaking in how much sort of media attention it received, and also together with this organization called HOME, Housing Opportunities Made Equal, really set the tone for the development of a local City of Cincinnati Eviction Prevention Fund, which is now in place. And so this project involved Elena and her team sort of mapping, developing sort of really empirical, local, neighborhood level eviction data that could be used for designing policy at the local level. So you see very clear connections between research and action, and research and policy. I'll give you one more example. All of these are linked in the slide for those of you who are interested. The other project that was interesting was in terms of its sort of visual and the media coverage of it, was a special exhibit that we put up in 2018 called What Is and What Can Be, Women of Color and the Struggle for Justice in Cincinnati. This was an oral history project which looked at the experiences of women of color in Cincinnati as they sort of engaged in sort of local activism and advocacy. And what is fascinating and really exciting about this work is that the outcome of this was not just a sort of a policy brief or a white paper or a research article. This was actually translated into an exhibit that was that was taken sort of from in multiple locations across the city and across the state, which included sort of audio samples of these oral narratives and oral histories that were conducted with local activists, and was really a way to connect sort of local voices to a broader sort of recognition of the structural disparities that exist for women, and especially women of color in the region. And that this exhibit then led to the identification of our annual theme, which was women of color at the center, and that became the sort of the theme for our symposium for that year. So these are just two examples of the work that we have done. I could provide a dozen more, but I need to be careful about time. I'd be very happy to answer questions and hear comments about what you would want to know about the Cincinnati Project. If you have ideas or you want to be associated with us, want to work with us, want to learn more, then please reach out to us on Twitter. You're always welcome to send me questions personally on my email. We are generally a very sort of open bunch and are open to feedback, criticism, and questions. So I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.